Hello, fellow senior seminar students and Dr. Spellman. Welcome to my research presentation. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Without further ado, my topic is a canonical approach to the Catholic epistles, and my thesis is that the goal of this paper is to contribute to the argument from Darian Lockett in his book, Letters from the Pillar Apostles, that the Catholic epistles could be understood as an intentional discrete collection set within the New Testament. My goal in my paper is to establish that the Catholic epistles can be approached this way based on the compositional evidence within the corpus and within the rest of the New Testament. In other words, I attempt to prove that the canonical relationship between books could have been intended by the authors. In order to do this, I analyze the textual relationship between James and 1 Peter as a case in point, and I attempt to show that the textual relationship between these two letters is intriguingly strong, and that when it is considered in light of other evidence in the New Testament, it's possible that James and Peter intended their epistles to be read in light of one another. First, I introduce the canon debate. The main point that I make here is the difference between two different concepts of canon. The concept of canon 1 emphasizes the authoritative nature of biblical texts because ultimately texts were recognized in the early church as authoritative prior to there being a fixed form of the canon. And Canon 2 emphasizes the final fixed form of the canon. Scholars who primarily hold to Canon 2 will understand that texts are authoritative once they are in the canon in its final form, whereas scholars who hold to Canon 1 are open to the possibility of there being a concept of canon before there's a final form of the canon. Second, I discuss some of the various canonical approaches to Catholic epistles. Two notable scholars in this area are David Nien-Huys and Robert Wall. They argue that the Catholic epistles ought to be read as a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. However, they emphasize the point of canonization as the point where the texts become scripture, and since they hold to a Canon 2 view of the canon, the implication is that the Catholic epistles don't become scripture until the 3rd or 4th century, and thus they downplay the importance of inspired authorship. My thesis is built around Darian Lockett's argument in his book Letters from the Pillar Apostles, and he argues that the Catholic epistles can be approached canonically and that it is not antagonistic to their composition. However, one shortcoming of Lockett's argument is that he doesn't explain how a canonical approach is not antagonistic to the composition. It's my goal in my paper to explain this. So thirdly, I analyze a number of textual connections between James and 1 Peter. In short, James and 1 Peter either cite or allude to 3 of the same Old Testament texts, and they both offer an extended reflection on Leviticus 19. Further, there are numerous verbal parallels between these two books, and often these verbal parallels are connected to theological concepts that the two books share. Finally, I argue that James and Peter may have intended their letters to be read in light of one another. I've already indicated that there is an abundance of textual evidence, and further, I argue that 1, the New Testament authors were aware that they were writing authoritative literature, 2, that they were aware of an emerging body of authoritative literature, which we now know as the New Testament. Third, I argue that the book of Acts depicts an early church that was very tight-knit. And fourth, I argue that the book of Acts depicts important decisions being made in the context of the believing community. And one of those decisions actually is the composition and sending of a letter in Acts 15. So in light of the additional evidence that I give, I conclude that it is possible that James and Peter wrote their epistles to be understood in light of one another, and that juxtaposing them in the canon within the Catholic epistles is actually in line with their intentions. Now to answer the questions that Dr. Spellman gave us. What was the most difficult part of my project? I would say that it was actually gathering and reading sources, because it felt like I wasn't getting anything done. When you're writing the paper, you actually feel like you're doing something and you can track your progress. You can see how many pages you've written in a day. But when I was reading sources, I often felt this desire to just start writing my paper. It felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. What surprised me most about my research was that once I knew the difference between Canon 1 and Canon 2, I could almost instantly tell the difference between the way that scholars thought about it. For instance, if I was reading one scholar and he mentions the word canon and immediately goes into 3rd and 4th century canon lists, I knew he held to a canon 2 type view. Or if I was reading another author and when he mentions the word canon, he starts talking about the composition and circulation of authoritative texts that eventually became the New Testament, I knew he was talking in terms of canon 1. And lastly, I think my project opens up paths for further research in the area of the book of Acts. As I was looking into the book of Acts and noticing connections between it and James and First Peter, mostly with the textual profile of James and Peter, they're very similar in Acts and in their letters. So it seems like Acts gives us a really accurate description of what the early church was like and how the apostles functioned therein. So I think when we're talking about the epistles and their historical context, it might be interesting to look at the epistles in their textual context and use Acts as a kind of narrative world for the epistles. So I think it would be kind of cool to do further research in the area of the textual theological relationship of Acts to the New Testament epistles, and that this could yield a lot of interesting findings. Well, that's my research presentation. Like I said, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks, guys.